They buried my husband on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday, I was no longer welcome in the drawing rooms that had once felt like home. The speed with which respectability can crumble is a lesson no young bride expects to learn. Yet there I stood at 30 years old, watching my entire world collapse like ash in the wind. My name is Eleanor Hartley, though I suppose now I am simply Eleanor, stripped of the protection my late husband's name once afforded me. Charles Hartley had been a gentleman of modest means, respected enough to grant me entry into the lower circles of county society, loved enough to make me believe our life together would last forever. But forever, I learned, is a promise the universe does not keep. He died in his sleep, they said, his heart simply stopping, as if it had grown tired of beating. I woke that April morning to find him cold beside me, his hand still resting near mine on the coverlet, and in that moment, everything I knew about safety and belonging died with him. The funeral was attended by those who had called us friends. They came in their black crepes and solemn faces, speaking in hushed tones about what a good man Charles had been, how devoted a husband, how tragic his passing. I accepted their condolences with the grace expected of me, my hands steady as I poured tea, my voice calm as I thanked them for their kindness. But I saw the calculations behind their eyes, the quiet assessments of my situation, the unspoken question that hung in the air like smoke. What would become of me now? The answer came swiftly and without mercy. Charles had left me the cottage and a small inheritance, enough to survive, but not enough to maintain my position. Without a husband to anchor me to society, without wealth to excuse my solitary state, I became that pitiable creature no respectable gathering wants, the young widow of modest means and no connections. The invitations stopped arriving. The afternoon calls ceased. Even Mrs. Pemberton, who had once pressed my hand and called me dear, crossed to the other side of the high street when she saw me coming. I learned to hold my head high as I walked through the village of Thornbury, my market basket over my arm, my morning dress growing shabby at the cuffs. I learned to smile politely when the shopkeeper's wife whispered behind her hand, to pretend I did not notice the way conversation stopped when I entered a room. Pride becomes a kind of armor when you have nothing else left to wear. The cottage Charles left me sat at the edge of the village, a small stone structure with a garden that had once been my joy. Now I tended it alone, my hands growing rough with work that no lady should have to do, my back aching from tasks that had once been performed by servants we could no longer afford. I grew vegetables to supplement the meager funds I had, sold eggs from the hens I kept, and darned my own stockings by candlelight because there was no money to spare for new ones. It was a lonely existence, but it was honest. And after watching the performance of grief and propriety at Charles's funeral, after seeing how quickly affection could turn to indifference when one's usefulness ended, I found a strange comfort in my solitude. At least here, in my small cottage with my chickens and my garden, no one could pretend to care about me while calculating the cost of their compassion. Summer came, and with it the heat that made the cottage feel small and airless. I spent my mornings in the garden and my afternoons in the cool shadows of the parlor, mending or reading the few books Charles had left me. In the evenings, I would walk to the edge of the village, where the fields opened up and the air smelled of hay and wildflowers, and I would let myself remember what it felt like to be happy. It was on one of these walks that I first heard the ringing of the hammer on the anvil. The smithy stood at the far end of the village, a stone building with smoke rising from its chimney, even in the warmest weather. I had passed it countless times, but had never had reason to stop there. Charles had always handled such matters, taking our horses to be shod, commissioning whatever ironwork we needed. But now one of the hinges on my garden gate had broken, and I could not afford to hire someone to repair it. I would need to purchase a new one and install it myself, a task that seemed daunting but necessary. I approached the smithy with some trepidation, clutching my reticule and rehearsing what I would say. The heat from the forge spilled out into the afternoon air, and the rhythmic clang of metal on metal grew louder as I neared the open door. I paused at the threshold, my eyes adjusting to the dimness inside, and that is when I saw him. He stood with his back to me, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle, his shoulders broad beneath the plain linen. The hammer in his hand rose and fell with practiced precision, shaping the glowing iron on the anvil before him. There was something almost beautiful in the motion, a kind of dance between man and metal, strength and control working in perfect harmony. I must have made some sound, for he turned suddenly, the hammer pausing mid-swing. His eyes met mine, and I found myself unable to look away. They were gray, the color of storm clouds, set in a face that was striking rather than handsome. All strong lines and sharp angles, softened only slightly by the shadow of stubble on his jaw. He was younger than I expected, perhaps 35, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, and an expression that was more guarded than welcoming. "Forgive me," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the sudden silence. "I did not mean to disturb your work. I am in need of a hinge for my garden gate, and I was told you might have one to sell." He set down the hammer and wiped his hands on a cloth, his gaze never leaving my face. His scrutiny should have made me uncomfortable, but instead, I felt strangely seen, as if he was looking at me rather than through me the way so many others did now. "Mrs. Hartley," he said, and his voice surprised me. It was deep and measured, with an educated accent that seemed out of place, coming from a man in a blacksmith's apron. "I have heard of your loss. Please accept my condolences." I felt heat rise to my cheeks, not from the forge, but from the unexpected kindness in his tone. "Thank you," I said. "You have me at a disadvantage, sir. I am afraid I do not know your name." "Thomas Gray," he replied, inclining his head slightly. "I am the smith here, though I have been in Thornbury less than a year. I keep to my work mostly, so we have not had occasion to meet." There was something in the way he said it, a hint of deliberate isolation that echoed my own. I found myself curious about this man who chose solitude, who spoke like a gentleman but worked with his hands, whose eyes held a kind of weariness that seemed far older than his years. "I understand the appeal of keeping to oneself," I said quietly. "The world can be rather exhausting, can it not?" Something flickered in his expression, a momentary softening that was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "It can indeed," he agreed. "Now, about this hinge. If you can wait a moment, I believe I have something that will suit your needs." He moved past me into the dimness of the smithy, and I caught the scent of smoke and iron and something else, something clean and faintly herbal that made me think of the woods after rain. He returned with a hinge in his hand, the metal dark and smooth, the craftsmanship evident even to my untrained eye. "Will this do?" he asked, holding it out for my inspection. I took it from him, feeling the weight of it, running my finger along the edge where the metal had been shaped and filed to perfection. "It is beautiful," I said, and I meant it, far finer than what I had before. "What do I owe you for it?" He named a price so modest that I looked up at him in surprise. "This is worth more than that," I said. "Surely you cannot make a profit selling your work so cheaply." His mouth curved in something that was not quite a smile. "I can afford to be generous, Mrs. Hartley. Consider it a kindness between neighbors. I should have simply thanked him and left. I should have taken the hinge and returned to my cottage and thought nothing more of the encounter. But something in his manner, in the careful way he maintained distance while still offering grace, made me bold. "I do not want charity, Mr. Gray," I said, meeting his eyes. "I have had quite enough of that disguised as concern. If you will not take proper payment, then perhaps you might accept an invitation to supper. I have little to offer, but my garden provides more than I can eat alone, and it would be pleasant to share a meal with someone who does not look at me as if I am a problem to be solved." The words hung in the air between us, and I realized with a jolt of mortification that I had just invited a tradesman, a man I had known for all of 5 minutes, to dine with me. The impropriety of it struck me like a physical blow, and I felt my face burn with embarrassment. "I apologize," I said quickly, stepping back. That was presumptuous of me. I did not mean to impose. But he was watching me with an expression I could not quite read, his gray eyes searching my face as if looking for the answer to some unspoken question. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentler than before. "You are not imposing, Mrs. Hartley, and I would be honored to accept your invitation, though I suspect the village will have much to say about a widow dining with the blacksmith." "Let them say what they will," I replied, and I was surprised by the fierceness in my own voice. "They have already decided what I am. I might as well give them something real to gossip about." This time his smile was genuine, transforming his stern features into something warmer, more human. "Then I shall call upon you tomorrow evening, if that is agreeable to you. And I insist you keep the hinge without payment. Consider it an advance gift to my hostess." He placed the hinge back in my hands, his fingers brushing mine for the briefest moment, and I felt something spark in that touch, something I had not felt since before Charles died. It was not attraction exactly, or at least not only that. It was recognition, the sudden awareness that perhaps I was not as alone as I thought, that somewhere in this village that had turned its back on me, there was another solitary soul who understood the weight of being apart. I walked back to my cottage with the hinge clutched in my hand and a strange lightness in my chest. That evening, as I prepared a simple supper for myself, I found myself thinking about Thomas Gray and the careful way he had looked at me, as if I was worth seeing. I thought about his educated speech and his rough hands, the contradiction of a man who seemed to belong nowhere and everywhere at once. I told myself I was simply being practical, that sharing a meal was a reasonable exchange for his generosity with the hinge. I told myself it meant nothing, that I was not breaking any rules by inviting a working man to dine. That grief had made me careless of convention, but not foolish enough to risk what little reputation I had left. But as I lay in bed that night, listening to the sounds of the summer darkness outside my window, I knew I was lying to myself. There had been something in Thomas Gray's eyes, something in the way he held himself as if bearing a weight no one else could see, that called to the lonely ache in my own heart. And for the first time since Charles died, I felt something other than the dull numbness that had become my constant companion. I felt curious. I felt interested. And underneath it all, buried so deep I almost did not recognize it, I felt the faint stirring of hope. Tomorrow he would come to my cottage, and we would share a meal, and perhaps we would talk about ordinary things, or perhaps we would say nothing at all. But in that moment, lying in the darkness with the weight of my solitude pressing down on me, the thought of his company was enough to make me believe that maybe, just maybe, I had not disappeared entirely into the shadows of my grief. Maybe there was still a part of me worth knowing. Maybe there was still a life worth living, even in this small cottage at the edge of a village that had forgotten my name. And maybe, I thought, as sleep finally claimed me, Thomas Gray, with his storm-gray eyes and his careful kindness, was the first step on a path I had not known I was ready to walk. I spent the following day in a state of nervous anticipation that felt both foolish and thrilling. I cleaned the cottage until every surface gleamed, polished the silver candlesticks Charles's mother had given us, and changed my dress 3 times before settling on a simple gray muslin that seemed appropriately modest for a widow, but not so severe as to suggest I was in deep mourning. After all, it had been 4 months since Charles died, and while society might frown on a widow entertaining so soon, I found I no longer cared what society thought. The garden yielded fresh lettuce and radishes, and I had stored potatoes and carrots in the cellar. I made a simple stew with the vegetables and a bit of salt pork, baked bread that filled the cottage with its warm scent, and prepared a custard with eggs from my hens. It was humble fare. Nothing like the dinners I had once served when Charles was alive and we could afford a cook, but I took pride in the work of my own hands. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, I set the small table in my parlor, using the good china that had been gathering dust in the cupboard. I arranged wildflowers in a jug, their cheerful colors a small rebellion against the drabness that had settled over my life. Then I sat by the window and waited, my hands folded in my lap, trying to calm the flutter of nerves in my stomach. He arrived precisely at 6, as the church bells were ringing the hour. I watched him walk up the path to my cottage, noting that he had changed from his work clothes into a plain but well-cut coat and trousers, his dark hair still damp from washing. He carried a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, and when I opened the door to greet him, he presented it to me with a slight bow. "For the table," he said simply. I unwrapped it to find a jar of honey, golden and pure, the kind that cost more than I could afford at the market. "It is too much," I protested, but he shook his head. "It is a gift freely given, Mrs. Hartley. Will you accept it in the spirit it is offered?" There was something in his tone that made me understand this was important to him, this exchange of equals rather than the condescension of charity. I nodded and stepped aside to let him enter. "Thank you, Mr. Gray. And please, call me Eleanor. Mrs. Hartley makes me feel like a stranger in my own home." "Then you must call me Thomas," he replied, his gray eyes meeting mine with that same intensity I had noticed in the smithy. "We are neighbors after all, and perhaps something more than that if we are to share bread together." The cottage felt smaller with him in it, his presence filling the space in a way that was not uncomfortable, but rather unexpectedly right, as if he belonged there. He looked around the parlor, taking in the worn furniture and the books on the shelves, the samplers I had stitched as a girl, the watercolors Charles had commissioned of the countryside. His gaze lingered on everything, assessing but not judging, and I found myself seeing my home through his eyes, wondering what he made of this small, shabby place that was all I had left of my former life. "You have made a home here," he said at last. "There is care in every corner. That is worth more than any grandeur." I felt my throat tighten at the unexpected compliment. "Come," I said, my voice not quite steady. "The stew is ready, and I am sure you must be hungry after a day at the forge." We sat across from each other at the small table, and I ladled stew into bowls while he cut the bread. For a few minutes, we ate in silence, and I was acutely aware of the sound of our spoons against the china, the crackle of the fire in the hearth, the evening birdsong drifting through the open window. It should have been awkward, this intimate domestic scene between two people who barely knew each other, but instead, it felt strangely natural, as if we had done this 100 times before. "You were right about the village," I said eventually, breaking the silence. "Mrs. Pemberton stopped me on the high street this morning to ask if I was expecting a caller this evening. I believe she has already assigned you the role of fortune hunter in whatever story she is spinning." Thomas looked up from his bowl, one eyebrow raised. "And what did you tell her?" "That my social calendar was none of her concern," I replied, and was rewarded with a flash of amusement in his eyes. I suspect that will only make the gossip more colorful, but I find I have lost my patience for managing other people's opinions. "A dangerous position for a woman alone," he observed, but there was no judgment in his voice, only a kind of understanding that suggested he too had made such choices. "Perhaps," I agreed. "But I would rather be honestly alone than falsely welcomed. There is a freedom in having nothing left to lose." He set down his spoon and regarded me thoughtfully. "Is that truly how you see your situation? That you have nothing left?" The question caught me off guard, and I found myself considering it more carefully than I had before. "I have this cottage," I said slowly. "I have my garden and my chickens and my books. I have my health and my hands and my mind." When I list it like that, it does not sound like nothing, does it? And yet the world would have me believe I am destitute simply because I lack a husband and a place in society. "The world is often wrong about what matters," Thomas said quietly. "I have found that the things people value most highly are often the things that bring the least true contentment. A title, a fortune, a name that opens doors. These are hollow victories if they come at the cost of one's peace. There was something in the way he said it, a weight behind the words that suggested personal experience rather than mere philosophy. I leaned forward slightly, curious. "You speak as if you have known such things," I said, "as if you have walked away from a life others would envy." He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant, and I thought perhaps I had overstepped, that he would close himself off, and the fragile connection between us would shatter. But then he looked at me again, and there was a kind of raw honesty in his expression that made my breath catch. "I was not always a blacksmith," he said. "There was a time when I lived a very different life, when I moved in circles where appearance was everything and truth was a luxury no one could afford. I saw the cruelty that elegance could disguise, the emptiness that wealth could purchase. And I decided I wanted no part of it. So I left, and I came here, and I learned a trade that makes my back ache and my hands rough but allows me to sleep at night without the weight of pretense." "Who were you?" I asked, barely breathing. "What life did you leave behind?" He shook his head slowly. "That man is dead, Eleanor. I buried him the day I walked away. Thomas Gray is who I am now, and that is all I wish to be. I should have pressed him for more, should have demanded to know the details of this mysterious past he was hinting at. But I understood too well the need to leave certain things behind, to become someone new when the old self had failed or been broken. So instead, I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. "Then I will know only Thomas Gray," I said softly, "and I will not ask you to resurrect ghosts you have laid to rest." His hand turned beneath mine, his fingers closing around my palm with a gentle strength that sent warmth spreading up my arm. "Thank you," he said, and those two words held more gratitude than I had heard in any of the elaborate speeches delivered at Charles's funeral. We finished our meal in companionable silence, and then I served the custard and tea while Thomas told me about his work, the satisfaction of shaping iron into something useful and beautiful, the meditative quality of the forge's rhythm. I found myself fascinated by the way he spoke about his craft, the obvious pride he took in work that society deemed beneath notice, the care he brought to every piece he created. "You love it," I said, watching his face as he described a particularly intricate commission he had recently completed. "The work itself, not just what it provides. That is rare, I think." "It is honest labor," he replied. "When I forge a gate or shoe a horse or mend a plow, I know precisely what I have accomplished. There is no ambiguity, no pretense. The iron bends or it does not. The weld holds or it fails. Everything is clear and true. I wish the rest of life were so simple," I said with a small laugh. "But people are not iron, are they? We bend in ways we do not expect, and the things we think will hold us together sometimes fail when we need them most." His gray eyes softened. "You are thinking of your husband." It was not a question, and I found myself nodding. "Charles was a good man," I said, "kind and steady and devoted. But when he died, I discovered that the life we had built together was more fragile than I realized. Without him, I simply did not exist to the people we knew. It was as if I had been an appendage, valued only for my connection to him, and when that connection was severed, I became invisible." "You are not invisible to me," Thomas said, and the quiet intensity of his words made my pulse quicken. "I see you, Eleanor, and what I see is a woman of remarkable strength and dignity, who tends her own garden and bakes her own bread and holds her head high despite being treated shamefully by people who should know better." I felt tears prick at the back of my eyes, and I blinked them away fiercely. "You barely know me," I whispered. "I know enough," he replied. "I know that you invited me here despite what the village would say. I know that you refused my charity but offered me friendship. I know that you speak your mind and ask difficult questions and do not flinch from hard truths. These are the measures of a person, Eleanor, not whether they are received in drawing rooms or mentioned in society pages. We sat in the gathering dusk, the candles casting shadows on the walls, and I felt something shift inside me, some frozen place beginning to thaw. It had been so long since anyone had looked at me the way Thomas was looking at me now, with interest and respect and something warmer that I was almost afraid to name. "Why did you accept my invitation?" I asked. "Surely you knew it would cause talk. A widow and a tradesman dining together. The village will have us married or worse by Sunday." "Perhaps I wanted to cause talk," he said with a slight smile. "Or perhaps I simply wanted to spend an evening with someone who does not bore me to tears with small conversation and false pleasantries. You offered me honesty, Eleanor, and that is a gift I value above all others." "Then I shall continue to be honest with you," I said. "I am lonely, Thomas, terribly lonely, and when I met you yesterday, I felt something I had not felt in months. I felt seen, I felt real, and I thought that even if it only lasted for one evening, it would be worth whatever price the village extracts from my reputation." His hand tightened around mine. "It does not have to be only one evening," he said quietly. "If you wish it, I would call on you again. I would walk with you, talk with you, share whatever time you are willing to give me. But you must understand that association with me will not improve your standing in this village. I am a tradesman, Eleanor, and my past is shrouded in mystery I cannot explain. If you are seen with me, you will be judged harshly." "I have already been judged," I said. "What more can they do to me? Bar me from gatherings I am not invited to? Refuse me entrance to homes that have already closed their doors? I have nothing left to lose, Thomas, and that gives me a freedom I never had when I was trying to maintain respectability." He studied my face for a long moment, and then he raised my hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to my knuckles, a gesture so old-fashioned and courtly that it stole my breath. "Then let us be outcasts together," he said, "and perhaps we will find that there is more truth and joy in our exile than we ever knew in the world that rejected us." The evening deepened around us, and we talked of many things and nothing at all. He told me about the woods beyond the village, the paths he walked when he needed solitude, the clearing by the stream where wildflowers grew in profusion. I told him about my garden plans, the books I loved, the dreams I had once had of traveling to places I had only read about. We discovered we shared a love of poetry, though his taste ran to the metaphysical poets while I preferred the romantics, and we spent a happy hour debating the merits of Donne versus Wordsworth. When at last he rose to leave, the moon was high and the village was quiet. He stood in my doorway, tall and solid and somehow more present than anyone I had known in years, and I realized with a jolt that I did not want him to go, that the thought of returning to my empty cottage and my solitary bed filled me with a kind of dread I had not acknowledged before. "May I call on you again?" he asked, and I heard the uncertainty in his voice, as if he genuinely did not know what my answer would be. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "Please do. I would like that very much." He smiled then, a true smile that transformed his stern face into something younger and lighter, and I glimpsed the man he might have been before whatever sorrow or disillusionment had driven him to Thornbury and his smithy. "Tomorrow evening," he suggested, "we could walk to the meadow I mentioned, if the weather holds." "I would enjoy that," I replied, and felt my own face relax into an answering smile. He took my hand once more, holding it gently as if it were something precious, and then he turned and walked down the path into the night. I stood in the doorway and watched him go, his figure growing smaller and then disappearing around the bend in the road, and only then did I close the door and lean against it, my heart beating fast and my mind racing. What was I doing? I barely knew this man, this blacksmith with a mysterious past and educated manners who spoke of walking away from one life and choosing another. He was not suitable, not appropriate, not the kind of man a widow should be entertaining in her home or walking with in meadows. And yet I found I did not care about suitability or appropriateness. Not anymore. I cared about the way he listened when I spoke, really listened, as if my words mattered. I cared about the gentleness in his strong hands, the intelligence in his gray eyes, the way he treated me as an equal rather than a burden to be managed or a problem to be solved. I cared about the fact that for the first time since Charles died, I had felt like myself again, like Eleanor rather than the tragic young widow or the pitiable Mrs. Hartley. I cleaned up from dinner in a kind of daze, washing the dishes and putting away the china, banking the fire and blowing out the candles. And when I finally climbed into bed, I did not fall asleep thinking about all the reasons this was foolish or improper or dangerous to my already tattered reputation. Instead, I thought about tomorrow's walk, about the meadow he had promised to show me, about the sound of his voice and the warmth of his hand in mine. I thought about the way he had looked at me across the table, as if he was memorizing my face, as if he could not quite believe I was real. And I thought, with a sense of wonder that was equal parts terrifying and exhilarating, that perhaps I was not done with living after all. Perhaps there was still room in my bruised and weary heart for something new, something unexpected, something that had nothing to do with the life I had lost and everything to do with the life I might still choose to live. I did not know then that Thomas Gray was not who he claimed to be, that the man I was beginning to care for was living a lie as carefully constructed as any I had abandoned. I did not know that his mysterious past would reach out and shatter the fragile peace we were building, or that the truth would force me to question everything I thought I understood about honor and honesty and love. But in that moment, lying in the darkness with the memory of his kiss on my hand and his promise to return, I was simply a woman who had been lonely too long, who had found an unexpected connection with another lonely soul, and who dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, we could build something real together. The village would talk, of course. They would whisper and speculate and condemn. But as I drifted toward sleep, I found I did not care about their whispers nearly as much as I cared about the thought of seeing Thomas again, of walking with him through the meadow, of discovering what might grow between two people who had both chosen truth over pretense, solitude over false companionship. Tomorrow could not come quickly enough, and for the first time in months, I went to sleep with a smile on my face and hope warming my heart like embers glowing in the darkness. The summer passed in a blur of stolen moments and quiet defiance. True to his word, Thomas called on me the following evening, and we walked to the meadow he had described, where wildflowers nodded in the breeze and the stream sang over smooth stones. We sat on the bank and talked until the stars came out, about everything and nothing, our words flowing as easily as the water beside us. It became our ritual, those evening walks. He would finish his work at the smithy and come to my cottage, sometimes bringing small gifts, a perfect apple from the market, a book he thought I might enjoy, once a delicate iron rose he had forged in a quiet moment. We would walk through the countryside, exploring paths that led to forgotten corners of the parish, and I would feel myself coming alive again, like a plant that had been wilting in shadow suddenly brought into sunlight. The village, predictably, was scandalized. Mrs. Pemberton made it her personal mission to ensure I understood the gravity of my transgression, stopping me outside the baker's shop to inform me that a respectable widow should not be seen gallivanting with tradesmen, that I was bringing shame upon Charles's memory, that I would be utterly ruined if I continued on this path. I listened to her lecture with what I hoped was polite attention, and then thanked her for her concern before going on my way. But I could not entirely ignore the consequences. The shopkeepers grew colder, their smiles thin and strained when I came to make my purchases. Women I had once known crossed the street to avoid greeting me. Even the vicar, usually a kind man, seemed troubled when he encountered me, his brow furrowed with concern he did not voice, but which hung in the air between us like incense. Thomas noticed, of course. He noticed everything. One evening, as we walked along the river path, he stopped suddenly and turned to face me. "This is hurting you," he said without preamble. "The gossip, the ostracism. I can see it wearing on you, Eleanor, no matter how bravely you pretend otherwise." I wanted to deny it, to insist I was fine, but I had promised him honesty, and I found I could not break that promise, even to spare my pride. "It is difficult," I admitted. "I thought I had grown accustomed to being unwelcome, but this is different. Before, they simply ignored me. Now they actively disapprove. There is a weight to their judgment that I had not anticipated." "Then we should stop," he said, and there was pain in his voice that matched the ache in my chest. "I will not be the cause of more suffering for you, Eleanor. You deserve better than to be scorned because of me." I reached for his hand, lacing my fingers through his, feeling the calluses on his palm that spoke of honest labor. "And what do I deserve, Thomas? To be welcomed back into drawing rooms where no one truly wants me, where I am tolerated rather than valued. To spend my evenings alone in my cottage, acceptable to society, but utterly isolated? Is that a better life than this?" I swept my free hand toward the river, the willows trailing their branches in the water, the evening light turning everything golden. "This," I said more softly, "these walks with you, these conversations where I can say what I truly think and feel, the way you look at me as if I matter, as if my thoughts and opinions are worth hearing. Is that not also something I deserve?" He pulled me closer, his hands framing my face, his gray eyes searching mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. "You deserve everything, Eleanor. You deserve joy and respect and love. You deserve a life that is full and rich and true, and if I could give you all of that without cost, I would do so gladly. But I cannot protect you from their censure. I cannot restore what my presence in your life is taking away." "Then let it be taken," I said fiercely. "I do not want what they offer, Thomas. I do not want their hollow approval or their conditional acceptance. I want this. I want you." The words hung in the air between us more than I had meant to say, a confession I had not known I was ready to make. His hands tightened on my face, and for a moment I thought he would kiss me, thought I would finally know the taste of his mouth and the weight of his body against mine. But instead, he rested his forehead against mine and closed his eyes. "Eleanor," he whispered, and my name on his lips was both prayer and lament. "You do not know what you are saying. You do not know who I am, what I have done." "I know you are kind," I replied, my own hands coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath my palms. "I know you are honest and thoughtful and strong. I know you make me feel alive again after so long feeling nothing but numb. What more do I need to know?" He drew back slightly, and I saw the conflict warring in his expression, the desire to tell me something struggling against the need to keep it hidden. But in the end, he only shook his head and stepped away, putting distance between us that felt like miles, despite being only a few feet. "I should tell you," he said. "You deserve to know the truth about me before you make any decisions that might bind your life to mine. But I am a coward, Eleanor, and I fear what that truth might cost me. I fear losing this, losing you, losing the one good and real thing I have found in all my years of searching." "Then keep your secrets," I said, though my heart ached with the understanding that there were things he was not willing to share, that there were parts of himself he held back even as he asked me to give him everything. "I will not demand them from you, Thomas. I will trust that when you are ready, when the time is right, you will tell me what I need to know. Until then, I am content to know the man you are now, not the man you once were." It was a lie, or at least not the whole truth. I was not content with his silence. Not really. I wanted to know everything, to understand the shadows in his eyes and the sorrow that sometimes crossed his face when he thought I was not watching. But I also understood that trust must be built slowly, that secrets revealed before their time could do more harm than good. And so I waited and hoped and told myself that patience was not the same as surrender. The weeks turned into months, and our companionship deepened into something that felt dangerously close to courtship, though neither of us named it as such. He came to my cottage nearly every evening, and we fell into a comfortable domesticity that both delighted and terrified me. He mended things around the house without being asked, fixing a loose shutter and reinforcing the chicken coop, and building me a new gate that was far finer than the old one had been. I cooked for him, simple meals that we ate together at my small table, and sometimes he would read aloud to me while I mended by lamplight, his deep voice turning poetry into music. We did not speak of the future, of what this arrangement meant or where it might lead. We existed in a kind of suspended present, each day a gift we did not examine too closely for fear of breaking the spell. But I knew it could not last, this fragile peace we had constructed. Something would have to give, some decision would have to be made, because we could not continue indefinitely in this liminal space between friendship and something more. The crisis came, as such things often do, from an unexpected quarter. It was late September, the air turning crisp with the promise of autumn, when I encountered Lady Ashford in the village. She was passing through on her way to some country house party. Her carriage stopped briefly at the inn to change horses, and she chose that precise moment to emerge and survey the high street with the air of a queen inspecting her domain. I had never met her, but I knew who she was. Everyone in the county knew Lady Ashford, the Dowager Duchess, a woman of formidable reputation and even more formidable wealth. She was perhaps 60, dressed in silks that cost more than my cottage, her silver hair arranged in an elaborate coiffure that must have taken her maid hours to achieve. And she was looking directly at me with an expression of such icy disdain that I felt it like a physical blow. I tried to pass by with a polite nod, to avoid any interaction, but she stepped deliberately into my path, blocking my way with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You are Mrs. Hartley," she said, and it was not a question. The widow who has been making such a spectacle of herself with the village blacksmith. I felt heat rise to my cheeks, but I kept my voice steady. "I am Eleanor Hartley, yes, my lady, and I am not aware that my friendships are any concern of yours." Her eyes narrowed, and I saw something calculating in her gaze, something that made me uneasy. "Everything in this village concerns me, girl. My family has held the patronage of this parish for 200 years, and I do not tolerate scandal in places that bear my family's name." "I am creating no scandal," I replied, lifting my chin. "I am simply living my life as I see fit, harming no one." "You are consorting with a tradesman," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "A blacksmith of all things. Have you no sense of your position, no regard for propriety? Your late husband may have been no more than a gentleman of modest means, but he deserved better than to have his widow dragging his name through the mud." "My husband is dead," I said, and I heard the hardness in my own voice, the anger I had been suppressing for months finally finding an outlet. And he would have wanted me to be happy, not to waste away in lonely respectability for the sake of appearances. "If you have come here to lecture me on morality, my lady, I suggest you save your breath. I have heard it all before, and I remain unmoved." She stared at me for a long moment, and I thought she would dismiss me, would turn away and leave me to my chosen disgrace. But instead, she stepped closer, lowering her voice so that only I could hear. "I know who he is," she said, and the words sent ice through my veins. "You're Blacksmith. I know exactly who Thomas Gray really is, and I know what he is running from. Do you, Mrs. Hartley? Do you have any idea what kind of man you have welcomed into your home and your life?" I felt the ground shift beneath me, the world tilting sideways as her words sank in. I wanted to demand answers, to insist she tell me what she meant, but pride kept my mouth closed and my expression carefully neutral. "I know him well enough," I said, though my voice was not as steady as I would have liked. Lady Ashford smiled, and it was not a kind expression. "Then you are either lying or a fool," she said. "But I suppose it does not matter which. The truth will come out eventually, as it always does. And when it does, you will understand exactly how thoroughly you have been deceived." She swept past me then, climbing back into her carriage without another word. And I was left standing in the high street with my heart pounding and my mind racing. What did she mean? What truth was she threatening to reveal? And why would a dowager duchess care about a village blacksmith unless there was something about Thomas that connected him to her world, to the aristocracy he claimed to have left behind? I walked home in a daze, her words echoing in my head. I know who he is. I know what he is running from. The implications were clear enough. Thomas was not simply a man who had walked away from a comfortable life. He was someone specific, someone Lady Ashford recognized, someone whose true identity was apparently significant enough to warrant her attention and her threats. I should have confronted him immediately, should have demanded the truth I had been so willing to wait for just days before. But when he came to the cottage that evening, I found I could not form the words. He looked tired, his face drawn with some worry he did not name, and when he saw me, his expression softened into such genuine pleasure that I felt my resolve waver. We walked in silence for a time, and he must have sensed my distraction because he finally stopped and turned to face me. "What has happened?" he asked quietly. "Something is troubling you. I can see it in your eyes." "I met Lady Ashford today," I said, and watched his face go pale, watched every trace of color drain from his features as if I had struck him. "She said she knows who you are. She said I have been deceived." He closed his eyes, and I saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. "What else did she say?" "Only that the truth would come out eventually," I replied. "Thomas, please, if there is something I should know, if there is some danger or complication I am not aware of, you must tell me. I cannot fight shadows. I cannot make choices without knowing what they truly mean." He was quiet for so long that I thought he would not answer, that he would retreat behind the walls he had built around his past and leave me standing there in ignorance and fear. But then he reached for my hands, holding them tightly as if anchoring himself to something solid. "I will tell you," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "I will tell you everything, Eleanor. Though I fear it will change how you see me, fear it will destroy what we have built together. But you deserve the truth, and I cannot ask you to trust me while keeping such secrets." "Then tell me," I urged. "Whatever it is, Thomas, whatever you have done or been, it cannot be worse than not knowing." But even as I said it, I felt dread settling in my stomach like a stone. Because I knew, with a certainty I could not explain, that what he was about to reveal would change everything, that the fragile happiness we had constructed was about to be tested in ways I was not prepared for. He looked up at the darkening sky, at the first stars appearing in the twilight, and when he spoke, his words fell between us like leaves from a dying tree. "My name is not Thomas Gray," he said. "It is Alexander Thornton, and I am the Duke of Ashford." The world stopped. The river stopped flowing. The birds stopped singing. My heart stopped beating. I stared at him, at this man I thought I knew, and saw a stranger looking back at me through eyes I had kissed in my dreams. A duke. He was a duke. Not just a man who had left behind wealth and comfort, but one of the most powerful peers in England, heir to a fortune so vast I could not even imagine it, holder of a title that put him so far above me in station that our relationship was not merely improper, but impossible. I pulled my hands from his grasp, stepping back as if he had burned me. "You are Lady Ashford's son," I said, and my voice sounded hollow to my own ears. "The Duke she spoke of in the village, the one everyone says abandoned his duties and disappeared years ago." "That is you." "Yes," he said simply. "That is me. Or rather, that is who I was. I left that life 5 years ago, Eleanor. I could not bear it any longer. The falseness, the cruelty disguised as civility, the way people were reduced to their usefulness or their bloodlines. I wanted something real, something honest, so I walked away from my title, my fortune, my responsibilities. I came here, to this village that bears my family's name, and I became Thomas Gray because Thomas Gray was the man I wished I had been born to be. All this time, I whispered, all these months, you let me believe you were a blacksmith. You let me confide in you about my struggles with poverty, my shame at being cast out of society, and you were a Duke Thomas, or Alexander. I do not even know what to call you anymore. Call me by the name I chose, he said, and there was pleading in his voice. Call me Thomas, because that is who I am when I am with you. The Duke is a ghost, Eleanor, a title and a burden I abandoned. He has nothing to do with what we have, with what we are to each other. But he has everything to do with it, I said, and I heard my voice rising despite my efforts to control it. Don't you see? Everything you told me was a lie. The man I thought I knew does not exist. You are not a simple tradesman who walked away from a comfortable life. You are one of the most powerful men in England, playing at being poor, playing at being ordinary, while I actually struggle to survive. How can you not see how cruel that is? I never lied to you about what matters, he insisted. I never pretended to be someone I am not in the ways that count. My feelings for you are real, Eleanor. My respect for you, my admiration, my desire to be with you, none of that was pretense. But everything else was, I said. The calluses on your hands, the modest clothes, the humble meals we shared. You were acting out some fantasy of noble poverty while possessing more wealth than I will see in 10 lifetimes. And you let me pity you. Let me worry about the scandal of our association, when all along you had the power to silence every tongue in this village with a word. I did not want that power, he said desperately. That is precisely what I was running from, the ability to command and control, to bend people to my will through fear or obligation. I wanted to be equals with you, Eleanor. I wanted you to know me as a man, not as a title. But we are not equals, I said, and the truth of it was like a knife in my heart. We never were. You were playing a role, living an adventure, while I was fighting to survive. And when you tire of this game, when you grow bored with your blacksmith's fantasy, you can simply return to your title and your fortune and your place in the world. But I will still be here in my shabby cottage with my chickens and my garden and my ruined reputation. What then, Thomas? What happens to me when you decide being a duke is more appealing than pretending to be common? I will never go back, he said fiercely. I swear to you, Eleanor, I will never return to that life. I would rather die than put on that mantle again. You say that now, I replied, and I felt tears burning behind my eyes, though I refused to let them fall. But Lady Ashford has found you. She knows where you are. Do you truly believe she will let her son, the Duke of Ashford, continue to disgrace the family name by working as a blacksmith and courting a penniless widow? She will force you to return, Thomas. She will use every weapon at her disposal to bring you back to the world you left. And you will go, because men like you always do. The obligations of your birth will outweigh whatever feelings you think you have for me. He reached for me again, but I stepped back, putting more distance between us. Do not, I said, my voice breaking. Do not touch me. Do not look at me with those eyes and tell me you love me when everything between us has been built on a foundation of lies. It was not lies, he said, and I heard the anguish in his voice. Eleanor, please, let me explain. Let me make you understand. I understand perfectly, I said. You are a duke who wanted to play at being ordinary for a while, and I was foolish enough to believe that what we had was real, that it could last, that I was not simply a diversion to pass the time until your real life called you back. The tears came then, hot and bitter, and I turned away so he could not see them fall. Go, I said. Please, just go. I need time to think, to understand what any of this means. I cannot do that with you standing here, looking at me as if I am breaking your heart when it is mine that is shattered." "Eleanor," he said one more time, but I shook my head violently. "Go," I repeated, "and do not come back until I send for you, if I send for you." I heard him draw breath as if to argue, but then there was only silence, and when I finally turned around, he was gone. I stood alone by the river as darkness fell around me, my arms wrapped around myself, as if I could hold the pieces together through sheer force of will. He was a duke, the man I had been falling in love with, the man I had shared my hopes and fears with, the man I had begun to imagine a future beside, was a duke, and I did not know if that changed everything or nothing at all, if his deception was unforgivable or understandable, if I could ever trust him again, or if this revelation had destroyed whatever fragile thing we had been building. I only knew that I had never felt more alone than I did in that moment, standing by the river in the gathering dark, mourning the loss of a man who might never have existed at all. I did not sleep that night, or the next, or the one after that. I lay in my bed and stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of what Thomas had told me, turning it over and over in my mind like a puzzle with pieces that refused to fit together no matter how I arranged them. He was a duke. Alexander Thornton, Duke of Ashford, one of the wealthiest and most powerful peers in England. I had read about him in the newspapers years ago, before Charles and I were married, when the young duke's disappearance had been the scandal of the season. The papers had speculated endlessly about what had happened to him. Some said he had been murdered, others that he had fled the country to escape debts or scandal, still others that he had gone mad and was being kept in some private asylum. But the truth, it seemed, was simpler and stranger than any of the rumors. He had simply walked away. The more I thought about it, the more I understood why he had done it. I had seen enough of aristocratic life, even from my position on its fringes, to know how suffocating it could be, how every moment was choreographed and every relationship calculated. And I remembered the stories about the Duke of Ashford, how he had been a serious, scholarly boy, more interested in books than balls, who had inherited his title at 20 when his father died suddenly. How the weight of expectation had settled on his shoulders like a yoke. How he had been paraded before every eligible young lady of suitable birth. How his every movement had been scrutinized and judged and found wanting by a society that demanded he be both ornament and authority. So he had left. He had abandoned everything, title, fortune, responsibility, and come to this village that bore his family's name to become someone new, someone honest, someone free. I wanted to hate him for the deception, for letting me believe he was something he was not. But when I was honest with myself, I had to admit that he had never claimed to be poor. He had said he walked away from a life others would envy, that he had chosen honest labor over pretense. I was the one who had filled in the details, who had assumed he was simply a gentleman's son or perhaps a disgraced younger brother of some minor family. He had not corrected my assumptions, but neither had he explicitly lied. And yet the omission felt like betrayal. Because the truth changed everything, did it not? It changed the balance of power between us, changed what our association meant, changed what future we could possibly have together. A widow of modest means might marry a blacksmith and live quietly in a village where everyone thought them peculiar but harmless. But a widow could not marry a duke, not really. Even if he renounced his title, even if he truly meant to stay in Thornbury forever, the world would not forget who he was. And I would become a different kind of scandal. Not the widow who lowered herself to marry beneath her station, but the nobody who had somehow ensnared a duke, the fortune hunter who had trapped him with feminine wiles and calculated seduction. The thought made me sick. 3 days after our confrontation by the river, Lady Ashford called upon me. I was in my garden, pulling weeds with hands that trembled from lack of sleep and too much thinking, when I heard the sound of carriage wheels on the road. I looked up to see an elegant coach stopping at my gate, the Ashford crest emblazoned on its door in gold and crimson, and I felt my stomach drop. She descended like a queen granting audience, her maid following with a parasol to shield her from the autumn sun. She surveyed my cottage and my garden with the same expression she might use when examining something distasteful on the bottom of her shoe, and then she turned that look on me. "Mrs. Hartley," she said, her voice carrying across the garden with perfect aristocratic projection. "I believe we have matters to discuss." I wanted to refuse her entrance, to tell her I owed her nothing and wanted nothing from her. But curiosity won out over pride, and I gestured toward the cottage. "Please, come in, my lady. Though I must warn you I have no servants to offer proper hospitality, and my accommodations are quite humble." She swept past me without comment, her skirts rustling like autumn leaves, and I followed her into my small parlor. She sat without being invited, arranging herself on my worn sofa as if it were a throne, and fixed me with a gaze that was sharp enough to cut glass. "I will be direct," she said. "My son has been playing at being a commoner for 5 years now, and I have allowed it because I hoped he would tire of the novelty and return to his responsibilities of his own accord. But it is clear he has no intention of doing so, particularly now that he has formed an attachment to you. Therefore, I must take action." I remained standing, refusing to be cowed by her presence in my own home. "What action would that be, my lady?" "I am prepared to offer you a sum of money," she said coolly, £5,000, to be paid immediately upon your agreement to end all association with my son, and to leave this village permanently. It is more than generous, I assure you. With such a sum, you could establish yourself comfortably elsewhere, perhaps in Bath or Brighton, where you might find a new husband more suited to your station. I stared at her, barely able to believe what I was hearing. "You wish to pay me to leave," I said slowly, "to buy me off like some common mistress." "I wish to remove an obstacle," she corrected. "You are a pretty enough woman, I suppose, and clearly intelligent enough to have caught Alexander's attention. But you must see that a union between you is impossible. He is a duke, girl. His bloodline traces back to the Plantagenets. He has responsibilities to his name, his estates, his tenants. He cannot throw all of that away for a penniless widow, no matter how charming she may be. And yet, he already has thrown it away," I pointed out. "He left 5 years ago, my lady, long before he met me. I am not the cause of his choices." "Perhaps not," she conceded, "but you are the reason he will not return. Before you, there was at least hope that he might grow weary of his rustic fantasy. But now he has something to stay for, someone who makes his self-imposed exile feel like home. Remove yourself from the equation, and he will have no reason to remain." "And if I refuse your offer?" I asked. "Then I will make your life here impossible," she said matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. "I own half the businesses in this village and hold the mortgages on most of the others. I can ensure that you are unable to purchase provisions, that you are denied credit, that every door is closed to you. I can make you so miserable and so desperate that you will beg to leave. The choice is yours, Mrs. Hartley. Take the money and go with some dignity, or refuse and be driven out with nothing." I felt rage rising in me, hot and fierce. "You cannot do this," I said. "I have done nothing wrong. I owe you nothing." "You have bewitched my son," she replied. "That is wrong enough. And as for what you owe deference to your betters, girl. You owe recognition of the natural order of things. A woman in your position should be grateful for the opportunity to improve her circumstances, not obstinate in clinging to an association that can only end in ruin for you both." I met her cold gaze with one of my own. "I do not want your money, my lady, and I will not be driven from my home by threats or bribery. If your son chooses to stay in Thornbury, that is his decision to make, not yours, and certainly not mine to prevent. Now I must ask you to leave." She rose, her expression hardening into something truly frightening. "You are making a grave mistake," she said. "I have destroyed better women than you for lesser offenses. Do not think your virtue or your pride will protect you. Nothing will protect you if you continue to stand in the way of my family's interests." "Then I suppose I shall have to weather your destruction as best I can," I replied. "Good day, my lady." She left in a rustle of silk and barely contained fury, and I sank onto the sofa she had vacated, my hands shaking with the after-effects of adrenaline. I had refused a fortune, had stood up to one of the most powerful women in England, and I had no idea if I had been brave or simply foolish. But I knew I could not take her money, could not let myself be bought and dismissed like some inconvenient complication. My pride would not allow it, and more than that, my heart would not allow it. Because despite everything, despite the lies and the hurt and the impossible complications of his true identity, I still loved Thomas, or Alexander, or whoever he truly was beneath both names. And I needed to understand if he loved me too, or if I was simply another piece of his escape fantasy, another way to prove to himself that he was not the Duke he had been born to be. Lady Ashford kept her promise with terrifying efficiency. Within 2 days, I found myself unable to purchase bread at the baker's, told coldly that my custom was no longer welcome. The butcher refused to sell me meat. The grocer turned me away at his door. Even the farmer who usually sold me eggs and milk suddenly claimed he had nothing to spare. I survived on what my garden provided and the few staples I had in my larder, but I knew it would not last. Winter was coming, and I would need fuel for the fire, warm clothing, provisions to see me through the cold months. And all of those things required money or credit, neither of which seemed to be available to me any longer. The village watched my slow starvation with a mixture of pity and satisfaction. Some, I think, felt sorry for me, but were too afraid of Lady Ashford's displeasure to offer help. Others seemed to feel I was getting what I deserved for reaching above my station, for daring to associate with a man so far above me in birth that the very idea was ridiculous. But it was not ridiculous to me. It was the most real thing I had felt in years. On the 5th day after Lady Ashford's visit, I found a basket on my doorstep. Inside were bread, cheese, apples, and a joint of lamb, along with a note in a hand I recognized immediately. "I cannot let you starve because of me. Please accept this. T." I wanted to return it, to refuse his help, just as I had refused his mother's money. But I was hungry, and the smell of the fresh bread was almost painful in its appeal. So I took the basket inside and ate, and hated myself for my weakness, even as I was grateful for his kindness. He came that evening, appearing at my door as the sun was setting. I had not sent for him, had not given him any sign that I was ready to speak with him, but somehow he knew I needed him. Or perhaps he simply could not stay away any longer. "May I come in?" he asked, and there was such weariness in his voice that I could not refuse him. I stepped aside, and he entered, moving to stand by the fire I had lit against the evening chill. For a long moment, we simply looked at each other, and I saw the toll the past week had taken on him. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed, his shoulders bowed as if under a great weight. He looked like a man being pulled apart by opposing forces, and I felt my anger soften into something closer to compassion. "Your mother came to see me," I said quietly. "She offered me £5,000 to leave the village and never see you again." His head snapped up, his eyes flashing with a fury I had never seen in him before. "She what?" "I refused," I continued, "and now she has made good on her threat to make my life here impossible. No one will sell me provisions. I am being slowly starved out, just as she promised." He crossed the room in 2 strides and took my hands in his. "Come away with me," he said urgently. "Leave this place. We will go somewhere my mother's influence cannot reach, somewhere we can start again." "As what?" I asked. "As the Duke of Ashford and his common law wife? As Thomas Gray the blacksmith and Eleanor Hartley the widow? Who are we, Thomas? Who would we be if we ran away together? We would be ourselves, he said desperately. We would be two people who care for each other, who want to build a life together, away from titles and expectations and all the things that do not matter. But they do matter, I said gently. You cannot simply wish away your birthright, any more than I can wish away the reality of our circumstances. You are a duke. You have responsibilities, whether you acknowledge them or not. And I am a widow with no fortune and no prospects, who would be seen as a fortune hunter and a scandal if I attached myself to you. Then we will go somewhere no one knows us, he insisted. We will be simply Thomas and Eleanor, with no past to weigh us down. For how long? I asked. A year? 5 years? 20? Eventually, someone will recognize you. Eventually, your mother or someone else from your world will find us. And then what? We run again? We spend our entire lives hiding from who you are. He released my hands and turned away, his fists clenched at his sides. I do not know, he admitted. I have no answers, Eleanor. I only know that I cannot lose you. I cannot return to the emptiness my life was before I met you. I went to him then, placing my hand on his back, feeling the tension in his muscles. Why did you leave? I asked softly. Why did you truly walk away from everything? He was quiet for so long I thought he would not answer. But then he began to speak, his voice low and rough with emotion. My father died when I was 20, he said. One moment he was giving orders about the estate, and the next he was lying on the floor of his study. His heart simply stopped. I became a duke overnight, with no preparation, no understanding of what was expected of me. And everyone was so kind about it, so solicitous. They told me what to do, how to act, who to marry. They treated me like a puppet, and I let them, because I did not know how to be anything else. He paused, and I waited, giving him time to find his words. I was engaged, he continued, to Lady Catherine Forsyth, a woman I barely knew, but who was deemed suitable by everyone who mattered. She was beautiful and accomplished, and utterly indifferent to me as a person. She wanted the title, the position, the power that came with being the Duchess of Ashford. And I was expected to marry her and produce heirs and carry on the family line as if my own desires and dreams were irrelevant. What happened? I asked, though I thought I could guess. I realized I could not do it, he said. I could not spend my life pretending to be something I was not, married to someone who did not see me at all. So I broke the engagement, 2 weeks before the wedding. The scandal was extraordinary. Lady Catherine's family threatened lawsuits. My mother was apoplectic. Everyone told me I had ruined myself, that I would never find another suitable bride, that I had brought shame upon the family name. And that is when you left, I said. That is when I understood that it would never stop, he replied. If I stayed, there would be another suitable bride, and another after that, and eventually I would marry one of them because the pressure would become unbearable. I would take my seat in the House of Lords and attend balls and manage my estates and do everything that was expected of me. And I would die inside a little more each day until there was nothing left of the man I wanted to be. He turned to face me then, and I saw tears glistening in his gray eyes. So I left, he said. I took nothing but what I could carry, and I learned a trade, and I came here to the village that bears my family's name, and I tried to build a life that was honest and real, and for 5 years it worked. I was content, if not happy. I had peace, if not joy. And then I met you, and suddenly contentment was not enough anymore. I wanted more. I wanted everything. He reached for me, cradling my face in his hands. I love you, Eleanor, he said. And the words fell between us like a benediction. I love you more than I have ever loved anything or anyone. I love your strength and your honesty and the way you see through pretense to what is real. I love the life we could build together, the partnership we could be. And I know I have no right to ask you to share my exile, to take on the burden of being associated with a man who has abandoned his duties and his name. But I am asking anyway, because I cannot imagine my life without you in it. I felt tears spilling down my own cheeks, tears I had been holding back for days. I love you too, I whispered. I love you so much it terrifies me. But Thomas, Alexander, whoever you are, love is not always enough. There are practical considerations we cannot ignore. Your mother has made it clear she will stop at nothing to separate us. And even if we run, even if we hide, you will always be the Duke of Ashford. That title is not something you can abandon like an old coat. It is who you are, written into law and blood and history. Then I will renounce it formally, he said. I will sign whatever documents are necessary to pass the title to my cousin. I will give up every legal right and privilege that comes with being the Duke. And then I will be simply Alexander Thornton or Thomas Gray or whatever name we choose. And we will be free. I searched his face, looking for doubt or hesitation, but I saw only fierce determination, and I realized that he meant it, that he would truly give up everything for me. The knowledge was humbling and terrifying in equal measure. But could I let him do it? Could I allow him to destroy his birthright, to abandon responsibilities that affected not just him, but thousands of others who depended on the Ashford estates for their livelihoods? Was my happiness, our happiness, worth more than the duties he was born to fulfill? I did not know, and the weight of that uncertainty was crushing. Let me think, I said finally. Give me time to understand what you are offering, what it would cost both of us. This is not a decision to be made lightly, Thomas. If we do this, if we choose each other, there is no going back. He nodded slowly, though I could see the fear in his eyes, the terror that I would ultimately choose the sensible path, the safe path, the path that led away from him. Take all the time you need, he said. I will wait. I will wait forever if that is what you require. He left then, and I was alone again with my thoughts and my fears and my impossible choice. Love or duty, freedom or respectability, a life of honest struggle with a man who saw me truly, or a life of lonely survival that preserved what little dignity I had left. I knew what the world would tell me to choose. I knew what reason and common sense dictated. But as I lay in bed that night, I found myself thinking, not about what I should do, but about what I wanted to do. And what I wanted, with a clarity that shocked me, was to fight. Not to run away, not to hide, not to let Lady Ashford or society or anyone else dictate the shape of my life. I wanted to stand beside Thomas, or Alexander, or whatever name he chose to answer to, and build something that was ours alone. I wanted to prove that love could matter more than station, that partnership could be worth more than prestige, that two people who chose each other freely could create something stronger than all the rules and expectations that tried to keep them apart. But I also knew that fighting would come at a cost, that we would face opposition and scandal, and perhaps worse, that his mother would not simply accept defeat and leave us in peace, that the life we built together would always be shadowed by what he had given up and what I had dared to accept. Was I strong enough for that? Was our love strong enough for that? I did not know. But as dawn broke over my small cottage, as light crept across the floor and promised a new day, I realized that perhaps the question was not whether I was strong enough, but whether I was brave enough to find out. And as I rose and dressed and went to tend my chickens and my garden, I felt something settling in my chest, some decision crystallizing like ice forming on a winter pond. I did not know yet what form it would take, what words I would use to express it. But I knew, with a certainty that felt like coming home, that I would not let fear make my choices for me. Whatever happened, whatever the cost, I would choose love. I would choose truth. I would choose the man who had seen me when everyone else looked through me, who had valued me when everyone else dismissed me, who had loved me not despite my circumstances, but because of the person I was beneath them. I would choose Thomas, and together, we would find a way to weather whatever storms his mother and society could send against us. Or we would drown in the attempt. But at least we would drown honestly as ourselves, with nothing left unsaid and nothing left undone. And in that moment, that felt like enough. I sent word to Thomas the next morning, a simple note asking him to meet me at the meadow by the river where we had spent so many quiet evenings together. It felt right to make my declaration there, in the place where I had first begun to understand that what we had was worth fighting for. He was already waiting when I arrived, standing by the water's edge with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders tense with anticipation. When he saw me approaching, his entire body seemed to shift, hope and fear warring in his expression as he searched my face for some sign of my decision. I did not make him wait. I crossed the distance between us quickly and took his hands in mine, feeling the familiar calluses, the warmth of his skin, the slight tremor that betrayed his nervousness. "I have thought about everything you said," I began. "I have thought about what it would mean to be with you, what we would face, what we would have to give up, and what we might gain. And I have come to a decision." He went very still, barely breathing, and I felt my heart ache at the vulnerability in his eyes. "I choose you," I said simply. "I choose us. Whatever that means, whatever it costs, I want to build a life with you. Not as the Duke of Ashford and some scandalous attachment, but as equals, as partners. If you truly mean to renounce your title, if you truly want to be simply Thomas Gray or Alexander Thornton with no aristocratic trappings, then I will stand beside you. But I need to know that you understand what you are giving up, that you will not wake one morning 10 years from now and regret what you have sacrificed for me." He pulled me into his arms then, holding me so tightly I could barely breathe, and I felt the shudder of relief that went through his entire body. "I will never regret choosing you," he said fiercely against my hair. "You are the only real thing in my life, Eleanor. You are the only person who has ever seen me, truly seen me, and loved what you found. How could I regret that? How could I regret a life lived honestly with someone who matters more to me than all the titles and estates in England?" "Then we do this properly," I said, pulling back to look at him. "We do not run away. We do not hide. You make your renunciation formal and legal, transferring your title and responsibilities to your heir. And then you marry me, here in Thornbury, in front of everyone who has whispered and judged and condemned us. We show them that our love is not something to be ashamed of, that we are choosing each other with full knowledge and open hearts." His smile was brilliant, transforming his entire face. "Are you proposing to me, Eleanor Hartley?" "I suppose I am," I replied, feeling my own lips curve into an answering smile. "Someone has to be practical about these matters, and you seem quite overwhelmed by emotion at the moment." He laughed, and the sound was pure joy. "Then yes," he said. "Yes, I will marry you. I will renounce my title, and I will marry you, and I will spend the rest of my life proving that I made the right choice." We sealed it with a kiss, our first, and it was everything I had imagined and more. Gentle and fierce, tentative and certain, a promise made with lips and breath and the beating of two hearts that had somehow found their way to each other across all the barriers that should have kept us apart. But even in that moment of perfect happiness, I knew we faced a difficult road ahead. Lady Ashford would not accept this quietly. The village would be scandalized, and there would be legal complications and social consequences that we could not yet anticipate. I was right to be concerned. When Lady Ashford learned of Alexander's intention to formally renounce his title, she descended upon Thornbury like an avenging angel, her fury barely contained beneath a veneer of aristocratic composure. She came to my cottage once more, but this time Alexander was with me, standing beside me in quiet solidarity. "You cannot do this," she said to him, her voice shaking with emotion I had not known she was capable of feeling. "You cannot simply walk away from 500 years of family history, from responsibilities that have been passed down through generations. What of the estates? What of the tenants who depend on Ashford protection? What of the family name? The estates will be in excellent hands with Cousin Edmund, Alexander replied calmly. He is a good man, capable and conscientious. He will manage them far better than I ever did. As for the family name, it will survive this scandal, as it has survived others. Names are resilient, Mother. It is people who are fragile. You are throwing away your birthright for this woman, Lady Ashford said, and the contempt in her voice when she looked at me was like a physical blow. She has bewitched you somehow, made you forget who you are and what you owe to your ancestors. Eleanor has done nothing but show me what real love looks like, Alexander said, and there was steel beneath the gentleness of his tone. She has asked nothing of me except honesty. She has offered me nothing except herself, freely given, with no calculation or pretense. You speak of what I owe my ancestors, Mother, but what of what I owe myself? What of the right to choose my own life, to find happiness on my own terms? Happiness. Lady Ashford spat the word like a curse. What is happiness compared to duty? What is personal satisfaction compared to the obligations of one's birth? You were raised to understand that privilege comes with responsibility, Alexander. Your father would be ashamed of you. My father was miserable, Alexander said quietly, and I saw his mother flinch as if struck. He was trapped in a life he never wanted, married to a woman he barely knew, playing a role he despised. He died at 50, Mother, worn down by the weight of expectations he could never quite meet. Is that the life you want for me? Is that the legacy you want to preserve? Lady Ashford was silent for a long moment, and I saw something flicker across her face, grief, perhaps, or the shadow of old regrets. But then her expression hardened once more. If you do this, she said, if you persist in this madness, I will cut you off completely. You will receive nothing from the family. No money, no support, no recognition. You will be dead to me. Then I suppose I am already dead, Alexander replied, because I have made my choice, and nothing you can say or do will change it. I am going to marry Eleanor. I am going to live here in this village as Thomas Gray, blacksmith. And I am going to be happy, Mother, even if you cannot understand or accept that happiness. She looked between us, her eyes cold and assessing, and I knew she was searching for some weakness, some crack she could exploit to drive us apart. But whatever she saw in our joined hands and united front must have convinced her that this battle was lost, because her shoulders sagged slightly and some of the fire went out of her expression. Very well, she said at last. If you are determined to ruin yourself, I cannot stop you. But do not come to me when you realize your mistake, when the novelty wears off and you understand what you have sacrificed. I will not welcome you back. I will not forgive this. I am not asking for forgiveness, Alexander said gently. I am simply asking you to let me go. She left without another word, her carriage disappearing down the road in a cloud of dust and broken hopes. And though I knew we had won this confrontation, I also knew the victory came at a terrible cost. Alexander had just severed ties with the only family he had left, had walked away not just from a title, but from a mother who, in her own cold and calculating way, had loved him. "Are you all right?" I asked softly, watching the rigid set of his shoulders as he stared after the departing carriage. "I do not know," he admitted. "I feel as if I should be more upset, as if there should be more ceremony to the ending of such fundamental relationships. But mostly, I just feel relieved. The last chain has been broken. I am finally free." The legal process of renunciation took several weeks and required us to travel to London to meet with solicitors and sign documents before witnesses. It was a strange experience. Watching Alexander, I still sometimes thought of him as Thomas, but was learning to reconcile both names into one complete person, formally divest himself of one of the oldest titles in England. The lawyers seemed both fascinated and appalled, unable to understand why anyone would voluntarily give up such power and privilege. But Alexander was adamant. He signed every paper, answered every question, and made it absolutely clear that this was his choice, made freely and without coercion. When it was done, when the final document was witnessed and sealed, he took my hand and led me out of the solicitor's office into the London streets. "How does it feel?" I asked. "To no longer be a duke?" He stopped in the middle of the pavement and pulled me into his arms. Right there in front of scandalized passers-by. "It feels like I can breathe for the first time in my life," he said. "It feels like freedom." We were married 3 weeks later, on a crisp October morning when the trees were ablaze with autumn colors and the air smelled of wood smoke and fallen leaves. The ceremony took place in the small church in Thornbury, with the vicar looking both worried and oddly pleased to be presiding over such an unusual union. The village came, of course. They could not resist the spectacle of the former duke marrying the penniless widow, even if most of them disapproved. They filled the pews and whispered behind their hands, and I could feel their judgment like a weight pressing down on my shoulders. But when I looked at Alexander standing at the altar in his simple but well-cut suit, when I saw the love and certainty in his gray eyes, none of it mattered. I wore a dress of deep blue silk, bought with some of the small inheritance Charles had left me, the last of it, actually, spent on this one extravagance. It was not a traditional white gown, but I was a widow remarrying, and I saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Alexander had given me a ring, a simple band of gold with a single sapphire set into it, and when he slipped it onto my finger and spoke his vows, I felt something settle in my heart that had been restless and aching for so long. "I, Alexander Thornton, take you, Eleanor Hartley, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to honor you, to cherish you, to build a life with you that is honest and true. I promise to choose you every day for the rest of my days, to be your partner in joy and in sorrow, in plenty and in want. This I vow before God and these witnesses." My own vows were simpler, but no less heartfelt. "I, Eleanor Hartley, take you, Alexander Thornton, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to stand beside you, to love you without reservation, to build with you a home where truth matters more than appearances. I promise to see you as you truly are and to love what I see. This I vow." When the vicar pronounced us man and wife, Alexander kissed me with a tenderness that made my eyes burn with tears. And as we turned to face the congregation, I saw not just judgment and disapproval, but also, on some faces, a grudging respect, perhaps even a kind of envy, as if they could see in us something they had lost or never had, the courage to choose love over safety, authenticity over acceptance. We held a small wedding breakfast at our cottage. Alexander had moved in the week before, helping me expand the small space to accommodate both of us. It was nothing grand, just bread and cheese and wine, but it was ours, earned and chosen and freely shared. A few of the villagers came, the ones who had always been kind or at least honest in their disapproval, and we laughed and talked and toasted to new beginnings until the sun began to set and our guests departed, leaving us alone for the first time as husband and wife. That night, as we lay together in the small bed that had once been mine alone, Alexander traced patterns on my shoulder with his fingertips and spoke into the darkness. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. "Marrying me, binding yourself to a man with no title, no fortune, no prospects beyond what his hands can forge." I turned to face him, pressing my palm against his chest where I could feel the steady beating of his heart. "How could I regret the best decision I have ever made?" I asked. "How could I regret choosing the man I love over the approval of people who never truly cared about me? I have everything I want, Alexander. I have you." He kissed me then, deep and sweet and full of promise, and we made love for the first time as man and wife. It was tender and awkward and perfect, two people learning each other's bodies and hearts, building with touches and whispers the foundation of a shared life. The months that followed were not easy. Lady Ashford kept her word about cutting Alexander off completely, and we lived on what his smithy work could provide, which was modest but sufficient. The village remained divided on our marriage. Some saw us as a romantic scandal, others as a cautionary tale about the dangers of crossing class boundaries. But we had each other, and we had our small cottage and our growing garden, and we had the satisfaction of living honestly in a world that prized pretense above all else. Alexander proved to be a talented blacksmith, his skill growing with each piece he created. Word spread of his craftsmanship, and soon he was receiving commissions from beyond Thornbury, from people who cared about the quality of his work rather than the scandal of his marriage. We were never wealthy, but we were comfortable, and more importantly, we were content. I learned to see both men in my husband, Thomas the blacksmith, with his rough hands and quiet competence, and Alexander the Duke, who had walked away from everything to find something real. They were not separate people, but facets of the same soul, and I loved both equally. He learned to see in me not just the penniless widow or the woman who had defied convention, but Eleanor, complete and whole, with dreams and fears and strengths all my own. We built a life together that was ordinary and extraordinary all at once. We worked side by side in the garden, preserving vegetables for winter. We read to each other by firelight on cold evenings. We walked through the countryside on Sunday afternoons, exploring paths we had not yet discovered. And we talked, endlessly talked, about everything from philosophy to parish gossip, finding in each other the conversation partner we had each been searching for all our lives. Spring came, and with it the news that I was with child. Alexander wept when I told him, his tears falling onto my hands as he knelt before me and pressed his face against my still flat belly. "We are going to be a family," he said wonderingly. "A real family, built on choice and love rather than obligation." Our daughter was born in December, on a snowy evening when the world seemed hushed and waiting. She came into the world with a lusty cry that made us both laugh through our tears, and when the midwife placed her in my arms, I felt something I had never experienced before, a love so fierce and complete it seemed to expand beyond the boundaries of my body. We named her Catherine after no one in particular, simply because we liked the sound of it and because she deserved a name that was all her own, not inherited or expected. She had Alexander's gray eyes and my dark hair, and she was perfect in every way that mattered. Holding her, watching Alexander cradle her with such tenderness and wonder, I understood that we had created something that transcended all the obstacles we had overcome. We had made a family, not through accident or obligation, but through deliberate choice. And in doing so, we had proven that love, real, honest, chosen love, was stronger than any title or fortune or social expectation. The first year of Catherine's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and profound joy. Alexander proved to be a devoted father, rising without complaint to walk the floor with our fussy daughter, singing to her in his deep voice about dragons and knights and brave princesses who saved themselves. I watched him become this new version of himself, still the blacksmith, still the man who had renounced his title, but now also a father who changed nappies and cooed over tiny fingers and toes. The village, slowly, began to soften toward us. It was hard to maintain scandal in the face of such ordinary domestic happiness. We were no longer the Duke and the widow who had shocked society with their inappropriate marriage. We were simply Mr. and Mrs. Thornton, with their baby daughter and their modest home, working hard and living quietly and harming no one. Mrs. Pemberton, who had once lectured me so severely, stopped me on the high street one morning when Catherine was perhaps 6 months old. She peered into the basket where my daughter slept and made the appropriate noises of admiration, and then she looked at me with something almost like respect. "You seem happy, Mrs. Thornton," she said, and there was genuine curiosity in her tone. Truly happy, not just pretending for the sake of appearances. "I am," I replied simply, "happier than I ever imagined I could be." She nodded slowly, as if confirming some private theory. Perhaps, she said carefully, there is more than one path to a good life. Perhaps some of us are too quick to judge choices we do not understand. It was as close to an apology as I would ever receive, and I accepted it with grace. Thank you, Mrs. Pemberton. That is kind of you to say. As Catherine grew, we told her stories about her father's past, simplified for her young understanding but honest in their essentials. We taught her that names and titles mattered far less than character and kindness, that the measure of a person was found in their actions rather than their birth, and we hoped that she would grow up free from the constraints that had shaped both our early lives, able to choose her own path without the weight of expectation or the barrier of class. On our 5th wedding anniversary, Alexander presented me with a gift, a small leather-bound book filled with his own handwriting. It was the story of us, he explained, written down so that Catherine would one day understand how her parents had met and fallen in love and chosen each other despite everything that tried to keep them apart. I read it by candlelight that evening, tears streaming down my face as I saw our courtship through his eyes, the first moment he had seen me in his smithy, the dinners we had shared, the walks by the river, the moment he had revealed his true identity and feared he had lost me forever. He wrote of his love with a poetry I had not known he possessed, and I fell in love with him all over again through the words on those pages. It is beautiful, I said when I finished, setting the book aside to curl against his chest. Thank you for seeing our story so clearly, for valuing it enough to preserve it. I want her to know, he said, his arms tightening around me. When she is old enough to understand, I want Catherine to know that love is worth fighting for, that happiness is worth choosing, even when the world tells you it is impossible. I want her to know that her parents built something real and lasting out of courage and honesty and sheer stubborn determination not to let anyone else dictate the shape of our lives. She will know, I promised. We will make sure of it. The years unfolded gently after that, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. We had another child, a son we named Thomas, after the identity Alexander had chosen for himself. Lady Ashford never reached out, never acknowledged her grandchildren, or softened her stance. But we built our own family, defined by love rather than blood, and we found that we did not miss what we had never truly had. Alexander's smithy prospered, and my garden became known throughout the county for the quality of its produce. We were not wealthy by society's standards, but we were rich in the ways that mattered. We had each other, our children, a home we had made with our own hands, and the deep satisfaction of living authentically in a world that often rewarded performance over truth. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep and we sat together by the fire, Alexander would look at me with wonder still fresh in his eyes and say, "I cannot believe you chose me. I cannot believe this is real." And I would take his hand, feeling the calluses that marked him as a working man, and reply, "I chose the truest thing I have ever known. How could I not?" Looking back now, from the vantage point of years and experience, I understand that our story was not a fairy tale. We faced real hardships, seasons when money was tight, illnesses that frightened us, moments when the isolation of our choice felt overwhelming. But we faced them together, and that made all the difference. I also understand now that Alexander's decision to renounce his title was not an act of irresponsibility, as his mother had claimed, but rather a profound act of integrity. He understood that he could not be the duke the world expected while remaining true to himself. And he chose truth over ease, authentic struggle over comfortable pretense. As for me, I learned that being cast out of society was not the disaster I had feared, but rather an unexpected liberation. Free from the need to perform respectability, I discovered who I actually was beneath the roles I had been taught to play. I found strength I had not known I possessed, courage I had not known I could summon, and I found, in choosing love over safety, that I had chosen the life I was meant to live all along. Our cottage in Thornbury became a kind of sanctuary for others who found themselves caught between the demands of society and the truth of their own hearts. We welcomed them, these misfits and outcasts, and offered them what we had been given: the knowledge that there was more than one way to live a good life, that happiness could be found in unexpected places, that love was worth every sacrifice it required. And when I am old, sitting in the garden that Alexander and I planted together, watching our grandchildren play in the same meadow where we used to walk, I will remember the woman I was before I met him. The lonely widow in her shabby cottage, convinced that her life was over, that she had nothing left to hope for or dream about. I will remember the day I walked into that smithy and met a blacksmith with gray eyes and careful kindness, not knowing that he was a duke, not knowing that he would become the great love of my life, not knowing that together we would build something more valuable than any title or fortune. And I will smile, because I will know that every difficult choice we made, every obstacle we overcame, every moment of doubt and fear and fierce determination, all of it was worth it. All of it led us here, to this life we chose, to this love we fought for, to this family we created out of courage and hope and the simple belief that we deserved to be happy. The widow married the village blacksmith, not knowing he was the Duke in disguise. But in the end, titles and disguises did not matter. What mattered was that two lonely souls found each other across the barriers of class and circumstance, that they chose love when the world told them to choose propriety, that they built a life together based on truth rather than pretense. And that, I have learned, is the only story worth telling, the only life worth living, the only love worth having. We chose each other freely and completely, and we never once regretted it. That is our truth. That is our victory. That is our forever.